welcome back to the channel. Today, a philosopher is going to be watching Dune.
Father, I'd like to ask to join Duncan, Idaho on a scout mission to Arrakis tomorrow. I've studied the Fremen language. I'd be an asset.
Out of the question. They'll travel in a few weeks to Arrakis like the rest of us.
I've been training my whole life. What is the point if I'm not allowed to face some actual risk?
Paul? You're the future of House Atreides.
And grandfather fought bulls for sport.
Yes. Look where that got him. I need you by my side. When we get to Arrakis, we'll face enormous danger.
What danger? Fremen? The desert?
Political danger. The great houses look to us for leadership, and this threatens the Emperor. By taking Arrakis from the Harkonnens and making it ours, he sets the stage for a war, which would weaken both houses. But if we hold firm and tap the true power of Arrakis, we could be stronger than ever.
What does that mean? Mining spice, keeping the Fremen in their place? We'd be no better than Harkonnens.
No. By making an alliance with the Fremen. That's what I've sent Duncan, Idaho to arrange. Here on Caladan, we've ruled by air power and sea power. On Arrakis, we need to cultivate desert power. I want you sitting in on my council. Learn what I do.
What if I'm not, Dad?
Not what?
The future of House Atreides.
I told my father I didn't want this either. I wanted to be a pilot.
You never told me that.
Your grandfather said, a great man doesn't seek to lead. He's called to it. And he answers. And if your answer is no, you'll still be the only thing I ever needed you to be. My son. I found my own way to it. Maybe you'll find yours. In their memory. Give it a try.
So, what are your first thoughts seeing that?
This is a scene about patriarchy. The word patriarchy these days has mainly negative connotations. In the film, it has mainly positive connotations. And I don't want to make a political point about patriarchy or otherwise, but it's patriarchy in the sense of the handing on of power through a family line, and in particular a male family line, so grandfather to father to son. And I think that's the kind of the dominant trope of that scene. And just in the clip we've seen, we go from the son's resistance to reluctance to acceptance. There's quite a clear kind of three-step process. And that's partly manipulated by his father, because his father is at the grave of the grandfather, so there's kind of pathos there at the beginning and a sense of the ongoing line. Towards the end, where he shows him, towards the middle phase really, where he shows him the ring as a sign of inheritance. And then finally this rather heartwarming moment where he says, well, you'll be my son anyway, kind of regardless, which in fact is rhetorically skillful, because he's on the one hand saying, look, you can just be my son if you like. But it's skillful because it, in a sense, melts away the last resistance and reluctance on the part of the son and makes him ready to accept the thing which he was reluctant and resistant to accept in the first place. So those are my kind of first thoughts about it. And of course, there's lots going on there in terms of symbology, the grave itself, the ring, being around the other graves in this city of the dead, the necropolis, being on the cliff edge, which suggests, of course, not just the imminent moment of departure, but the transition from one generation to the next as well. So it's a highly kind of symbolic moment in the film. And that, of course, is borne out by this perhaps rather obvious music, which is it's kind of two stops short of foreboding.
It is, isn't it?
But nevertheless, has a sense of gravity and a sort of subdued epic quality to it, I suppose.
Yeah, that's quite interesting considering what happens to his dad later on. So, I wonder if that was on purpose.
So patriarchy, I think, is one of the key things then. But it's not just patriarchy for patriarchy's sake, because we're talking about the patriarchy within a system of power. Because you could argue there's patriarchy whenever there's a line of power from grandfather through son to grandson. But in this case, clearly we're talking about political power as named by the middle generation here, the father here, which makes of it a de facto monarchy, because power is being passed through a bloodline rather than through a democratic line. There isn't a sense that the next leader, here acted by Timothy Chalamet, could have been elected democratically. It's not about that. This is about a bloodline. So we're talking about a de facto monarchy, even though it's not necessarily called that. So it's a patriarchy, genetically male, and it's a line of succession that passes power through those generations.
The interesting bit that I picked up on then was the elements, like when he talks about we use the air and sea power here, and in Arrakis it's desert, which is basically earth and fire, isn't it? So they're kind of changing how they're using the elements.
Yeah, and it's elemental in that we're on this exposed cliff top and the sea's in the background, and I think that's, in a way, that this scene does lots of things, and there's all sorts of references to other works. One of the many, many references in that scene is probably back to Shakespeare and the idea of the heath in Shakespeare as this place of exposure and existential insight, where the outer claddings of power are at once reinforced and taken away. So in King Lear, we have the king stripped down to nakedness, really, as he recognises that he's reached the end of his own succession and that he can't control who comes after him because his sisters have now taken that over from him. So that's quite an explicit shift from a patriarchy to a matriarchy in King Lear. So that's one, there's an awful lot going on in that scene in terms of the allusions it creates, but that's one of them. And the elemental, the kind of cosmological elemental environment is supposed to say, here is a blank slate for the exploring of the soul, And at the same time, it's not free of all that symbology. So, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, and just all the gravestones. I guess I hadn't taken that in as well, that they're surrounded by it's like a hall of kings, from the medieval times or something.
It's like a hall of kings,
or Valhalla.
Like Valhalla, like a pantheon.
Yeah.
And the idea is that we are among
great men.
We're among great men, and. Of course, a feminist reading of that in terms of feminist history would say, well, that's entirely the problem, because the Victorian notion of history being the history of great men is one we have spent a lot of time critiquing.
But also in the movie, there's a big emphasis on like feminine power. Like,
right.
I mean, it's behind the scenes. It's all the strings being pulled by women, by the what are they called? The Bene. I can't remember.
Okay.
But yeah, the women are basically manipulating a lot of the stuff. So
there's a power behind the throne.
So there is a power. Yeah, it's definitely not a sexist movie in any way.
No, and that's why I was sort of at pains to say this is patriarchy, which it is, but not necessarily with that.
Yeah, it's positive. It's like the new term now is non-toxic masculinity.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because the Chalamet character initially, because he's almost playing an adolescent in that, is almost reflecting back to his father that this is indeed toxic masculinity and he doesn't want to be part of it. He's got his own path to follow. He wants to be a pilot. He wants to step outside that line of patriarchy because he sees it as something potentially toxic. There's a slightly snide reference to his grandfather as just, chasing bulls. And we have that initial image, graven image of the grandfather with the spear, suggesting that past. And I think we're talking about the number of allusions in this piece. I was assuming that was some sort of reference to the Minotaur and chasing down the bull, which is this figure of sort of unspecified antagonism and a kind of nemesis that must be hunted down. There's a question there. What does good and bad male energy look like? Which that scene is sort of exploring. And the father, again very cleverly, wants to say, okay, well, you might not accept this version of male energy, the patriarchal inheritance version, but there's still father-son energy, which is good. And just that is enough to create that smile of connection and bonding right at the end between the two men. So I think it's not that there's not toxic masculinity in that. It is raised as a spectre for the younger generation to evoke, but actually quite rapidly in that scene, he is willing to yield that position for his father. It's interesting to this notion of calling and duty. And one can read it a little bit cynically. So the father is invoking the notion of a calling to this role for his son. But of course it's completely in his interest that his son does this. So he is, as it were, recruiting the forces of destiny and fate and calling to his own purposes. So there may well be a higher calling, there may well be a higher vocation, but it's rather convenient, it suits the father that that's the case.
Yeah, or could it be that he is genuine and maybe the way that he is, maybe he's, got a stoic outlook on life, and that if his son doesn't want to do it, then he will accept it. But he will try his best to push him that way, but actually, I don't know, because I think that line at the end, I don't know, it seems like it was genuine.
It's genuine, but it's also rhetorically skillful. I think it can be both at the same time. And the timing of, taking his glove off and showing him the ring, I mean, it's a very well-paced scene of, persuasion. Because that's what we're going from, and that's from the unpersuaded to the persuaded son. But on this notion of, a calling, that notion is typically associated with religious calling, a vocation, because there's a calling from God. And, most often it's associated with monks and nuns who decide to pursue a religious life as if they have heard a call from God which they can't really resist or feel they shouldn't resist. And the father is evoking the power of something quasi-theological by referring to, the calling. He's appropriating it for the monarchical line, the line of kings, even though it really has its origin in the line of divinities. So again, it's sort of quite a clever elision of those two things. I think it's worth also saying, there's a little bit of a martial, as in military, martial set of virtues there to do with leadership, which is this sense that, you, dear son, need to step up now.
Yeah.
Because whatever leadership is, it is stepping up. It's not ceding to somebody else to take control.
Yeah.
And stepping into the place where there is risk. Because if you lead only in the place where there's certainty and no risk, arguably you're not leading at all. You're just managing a situation that's free of any particular jeopardy. So in a way, we're also being given a definition of what leadership is in that scene.
Yeah.
Leadership is A, recognizing there's a future void in the leadership, B, stepping up into that void where you could have declined, and C, recognizing that in stepping up, you're taking on the prospect of failure as much as victory, and it's that risk which really defines what leadership is. This could go right or wrong, but I'm holding it and I'm accepting that risk so that other people don't have to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's why he's such a good leader.
Right.
The Duke. Like, I see him as quite, like, in movies, I think he's up there, like, as a kind of a really good leader.
Right. I mean, it's interesting he's called the Duke because I think the other potential Shakespearean allusion there is to the Tempest, with Prospero being the Duke of Milan, or Milan as it's pronounced in the play, on an island, and the fact that that is set on a cliff edge, suggests that we are in some isolated place. And again, there's a transition of power. Now, in the case of the Tempest, Prospero is keen to hand it on to the next generation via his daughter to a daughter and a husband. So it's a right of sexual marital union that precedes the handing over of power. Whereas in this scene, at least, and I appreciate what you say about women being in the background of this, in this case, we're not seeking to get him married off. The father is not saying, you must go and marry Queen Isabella, Princess Isabella of Spain or something in order to create a political union. He's not really talking about. He's preserving the unity of the empire, or whatever the political state is called in the film, through this stage, at least, through a kind of solitary male line. It's not about creating the next generation yet. So there is an allusion to, I think.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because actually his well, it's not his wife. Like there's a whole thing that Paul's mother is a I still can't remember the word. Bene Gesserit.
Okay.
And they're not married, so he's like I believe he's like a single man as the Duke.
Right. Interesting.
So, yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, because, in The Tempest, it's a play about many, many different things, but about generation in all sorts of ways. And this is about generations and regeneration. And in fact, yet another allusion in that is to a whole mythology around what happens when the king is about to fade away or recede. Will the land be restored? Will there be a failure of the crops? Will the wasteland grow? How do we replenish? How is the waning power revived through a new power in some ways, so that the prospect of the wasteland is avoided? And it's interesting that they're moving to a desert because we associate deserts with wasteland, but really he's turning that trope on its head by saying the wasteland that is the desert could in fact be a politically fertile place for us to arrive, as opposed to a place of destitution or poverty or starvation. That's interesting. The change of power from a king, what will happen? Because he does go to that planet and he's killed.
I don't think that's a spoiler. Yeah, so actually that scene in the graveyard, that's kind of a very much forebearing that he's going to end up there.
Well, and presumably that's one of the reasons why it's shot in the graveyard, as a kind of prolepsis, looking forward to what's going to ultimately happen. Like, the father is promising a transition of power without any ostensible limit to it, but the graveyard in the background suggests, well, whatever it is, it's going to be finite. And they're all going to end up in their graves in their different ways. And perhaps the Minotaur remains unslayed or keeps coming back. I mean, one of the interesting things to me about seeing that graven image right at the beginning is that, you know, once you engrave something, you give it permanence. So on the one hand it's done with, but on the other hand it survives, you know, and perhaps that's a good image for the film. Thanks very much for watching this video. It's very much appreciated. If you do like it, please give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to the channel. Thank you.